and this is The Primary Nerd. Welcome, everyone. I'm Courtney, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian.
Hey, everybody.
And this is Titanic Episode 8.
Oh, I'm so glad that we're back.
I am so glad that we're back, too. It was entirely too long, but you had an exciting end to the summer.
Oh, we sure did. We had a family, got to see our family in Idaho and California and Oregon and Texas. So all in the span of about 3 weeks. So it was it was wonderful to see them, but it's always nice to be back home.
And then I got to take our quote, vacation for the summer right before my son started his first grade. And so we went out to California too. And, that was absolutely lovely. But of course, we are so happy to be back and to be back with all of you to continue on with our discussion of Titanic.
Yes, I'd like to give a shout out to Sam from Australia. Thank you so much for your email. And I'm just so glad that you're enjoing the podcast.
That was so exciting when
yeah.
Dad called me to say, hey, we got this email from a guy from Australia, and he's loving what we're doing, and it was like, yay!
And I also want to give a shout out to all of our listeners in Mexico and Sweden, Ireland, Brazil, of course the USA, Australia, and also the UK. So it's awesome. It's very cool. History knows no bounds.
It really doesn't. Now, we had a listener reach out with a question. We had the Roberta Watt quote, and she was loading into one of the lifeboats, and she gave an estimation for how many were in the lifeboat. And I had said at the time, well, we know that number is incorrect. So one of the listeners reached out and was like, okay, I would love some clarification because the purpose of the podcast is to be listening to the primary sources and to be gaining our information from them. So how can you then listen to this primary source giving a number and feel comfortable saying that her number is wrong? Like, how do these two things work together? And it is a fabulous point. And I guess the best way I would explain it is much like we've been talking about in times of disaster, where people who are witnesses to, let's take it to true crime or some sort of anything really that happens on the street. And you're trying to estimate, there was a fist fight at school. How many people were around the two people fighting? I don't know, 50, 100. It's really hard for people to estimate things like this.
Sure.
And then also they would have been either sitting or standing. It's not like you have a bird's eye view to, sit there and count. There are actually quite a few accounts of people that were in the lifeboats that did not realize they were in a lifeboat with somebody that they knew until after the fact when they're comparing notes.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
So, yes, you're absolutely right. The whole purpose is to be listening to the primary sources and what they have to tell us, but then also there is a bit of reading between the lines, contextualizing, and there's just certain things that after the fact, the pictures were being taken of people coming up in the lifeboats alongside Carpathia. And then after the fact, historians have been trying to count the people that were in the lifeboats. Mm-hmm. So there's been a lot of things after the fact to try to determine real numbers.
There are a lot of variables in that sort, and that the whole Titanic story is a lot of moving pieces.
It is. Now, speaking of variables, speaking about people in lifeboats. So we have a visual aid that we have up on our website, theprimarynerd.com. It shows the different places of the lifeboats as they are on the boat deck. Granted, it's not to scale, but it also has kind of a meter. It tells you approximately what time that boat had launched, and it gives you about how full the lifeboat was. I would like to put a great big caveat out there because I'm always looking for new things. I am always making sure that the information that I'm giving you guys is accurate, that it is verifiable, and that is there anything else that I need to bring to your attention? And I found quite a bit of research out there that this person says this number, this person says that number, and it was like, gosh, we could go with a range. But some of the ranges are smaller for certain boats, and some of the ranges get like 28 to 40 people, where it's almost unusable with how wide the range is.
That would be too wide.
I just want to put a great big caveat out there. There are so many different interpretations of the amount of persons in each lifeboat. Please feel free to go explore for yourselves, but I just want you guys to be aware that I'm aware that those numbers are not they're potentially not 1,000% correct.
They're not hard and fast.
They are not hard
Not
and
hard
fast.
and fast, no.
So I would never want to lead anybody astray. I would never want anybody to feel like they just took this bad information and passed it along. If I could get you guys the real number, I absolutely would. There doesn't seem to be a consensus on a real number.
Oh, so but giving a number, we're just nothing more. We're giving a context to what was happening. That's all. So, and like you said, there's so many variables, and there's a lot of variations in through the different research that you've looked at. So, no, I appreciate you doing that because I want the information that we share here to be as accurate as possible.
Absolutely.
And so I really do appreciate you doing that. So where we left off last episode is that we discussed the loading and launching of the aft starboard lifeboats on Titanic, particularly the conditions that existed within that neighborhood, which influenced the passengers' decisions. Now that we have covered all 8 of the wooden lifeboats, the only boats that remain on the starboard side are the collapsible ones stored on top of the officers' quarters near the bow, which we will discuss in a later episode.
So for this episode, we will continue our exploration of the Titanic saga from the passenger's perspective, with a focus on the port lifeboats. Now please note, unless I specify otherwise, all the lifeboats we'll talk about today are on the port side. I was doing a read-through before, and I was like, my gosh, I must have said port about 1,000 times. So we're just going to say this right now. We are on port. So unless I say, in comparison to the starboard side, please assume that we're on the port side.
Yeah, there you go.
So it is inevitable that you will notice certain parallels between the port episodes and the starboard episodes. We have discussed certain discrepancies between the two, and we're going to highlight a lot more of their differences today. But port and starboard were two halves of the same whole, and therefore we cannot completely divorce them from one another. The bottom line, the same tenets were not followed on both sides of the ship. And even on the same side, there are documented instances where the rules seem to change minute by minute. Therefore, the information and instructions that the first and second class passengers were given was dependent upon which side of the ship they found themselves at a particular moment in time, which in turn affected who survived and who did not. Heads up, the launching of the port lifeboats was not nearly as straightforward as it was on the starboard side.
Very, very different.
Holy cow. The timeline of launched starboard boats is incredibly straightforward. The entire forward section was launched first, and then the entire aft section. In comparison, the port side is all over the place. We will still be examining the forward and aft neighborhoods, but unlike during the starboard episodes, we will have to run back and forth between the port neighborhoods quite a bit. So with that, let's go back in time.
Before 12:40 a.m., the passengers on the boat deck were still enduring the biting cold and piercing sound of steam blowing off while they were waiting to be given any information. Survivors later said that they fully expected to be instructed to go back to bed. But the long wait ended with a surprise. The officers on both sides of the ship began calling for women and children to step forward and began loading into the lifeboats. The order for women and children to make their way to the lifeboats particularly stood out in second-class passenger Charlotte Collier's mind. Quote, "Then above the clamor of people asking questions of each other, there came the terrible cry, 'Lower the boats! Women and children first!' Those words struck utter terror into my heart, and now they will ring in my ears until I die. They meant my own safety, but they also meant the greatest loss I've ever suffered, the life of my husband." Soon after the call for women and children to start loading into the lifeboats, Captain Smith issued another order that all women and children should report to the port side of Promenade Deck A.
First-class passenger Mae Futrell remembers the officers passing along these orders. Quote, "When we stepped out of the cabin, the officer said women and children will go to the promenade deck. The men will remain where they are. No man was supposed to be on the boat deck. This was the obvious requirement of the discipline, which the officers attempted to put into force. Oh, that was a terrible moment. It was awful, awful. Each woman there kissed her husband. Men made an effort to still cheer further their wives by stating that the danger was not grave and that everybody would get off safely. I saw Mrs. Strauss clinging to her husband, Isidore, the New York banker. I heard her say to an officer who was trying to induce her to get into a boat, 'No, we are too old, we will die together.' Other husbands had great difficulty in persuading the women to leave them. Jacques stood there perfectly cool, saying, 'No, dear, I will follow you by and by.' I did not want to leave him, but he filled me with so much confidence that I obeyed and turned and walked onto the deck with an officer."
The first forward port lifeboat to be prepped for loading was boat number 4. First class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie described the scene at the time. Quote, out on deck A, port side, towards the stern, many men and women had already collected. I sought and found the unprotected ladies to whom I had proffered my services during the voyage when they boarded the ship to Southampton.
And just so you know, because this is going to be important later, these ladies that he is offering his protection to, their names are Mrs. Appleton, Mrs. Cornwell, Mrs. Brown, and Miss Edith Evans.
You say Cornwell or Cornell? Cornell.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Cornell.
Cornell. Very good. Thanks. Mr. and Mrs. Continuing the quote from Archibald Gracie, Mr. and Mrs. Strauss, Colonel and Mrs. Astor, and others well known to me were among those who congregated on the port side of Deck A, including, besides Clinch Smith, two of our cotier from after-dinner companions, Hugh Woolner and H. Bergstrom Stephenson. When the order to load the boats was received, I had promptly moved forward with the ladies in my charge towards the boats, then being lowered from the boat deck above to Deck A on the port side of the ship, where we then were. A tall, slim young Englishman, Sixth Officer J.P. Moody, whose name I learned later, barred the progress of us men passengers any nearer to the boats. All that was left me was then to consign these ladies in my charge to the protection of the ship's officer, and I thereby was relieved of their responsibility and felt sure they would be safely loaded into the boats at this point.
The lifeboat that Colonel Gracie saw being lowered from the boat deck to Promenade Deck A was Forward Port Lifeboat Number 4. After Gracie walked away, secure in the belief that the ladies under his care would soon be safely lowered overboard, first-class passenger Hugh Woolner approached Captain Smith with a worrisome observation. Quote, the captain said, I want all the passengers to go down on A deck because I intend they shall go into the boats from A deck. I remembered noticing as I came up that all those glass windows were raised to the very top, and I went up to the captain and saluted him and said, haven't you forgotten, sir, that all those glass windows are closed? He said, by God, you're right, call those people back. So we've talked about this before, but this means that none of the forward port lifeboats could be lowered from the forward section of Promenade Deck A until the special crank used to open the windows was located. Second Officer Lightoller left boat number 4 lowered parallel to Deck A and sent a couple stewards to find the window crank to open said windows. But according to historian Hugh Brewster, there was another issue. He asserts that, quote, a wooden spar protruded just below the windows and had to be chopped away.
What in the world? A wooden spar in the way of a lowering of a lifeboat.
And this is where, I gotta tell you, I have not seen anything, just looking at the images. I did a lot of searching images for Titanic. I have not seen anything sticking out from the side in any pictures. I have not encountered a primary source that talks about a spar. I tried to hunt down everybody that came into contact with boat number 4. I have not been able to find anything about this, but obviously
there was something there.
Brewster got this information from somewhere.
Interesting.
So if anybody has anything, if anybody knows where this comes from, please share it with me, because at this point it's keeping me up at 2 a.m. And just because I haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not possible.
That's true.
So,
that's true.
If this is true, then not only did the crew need to find that special crank and manually lower the windows on Promenade Deck A, they would also have needed to chop away the wooden spar if they ever hoped to launch boat number 4. All of this would take time, but in the meantime, the women and children who had reported to the port side of Promenade Deck A were told to make their way back up to the boat deck.
Oh my goodness, back and forth. So, first-class passenger Martha Stevenson and her sister Elizabeth were in the companionway on Promenade Deck A when the order was issued for passengers to make their way back up to the boat deck. Martha's account illustrates the frustration that many passengers felt when confronted with multiple conflicting orders. Quote, Elizabeth and I took each other's hands, not to be separated in the crowd, and all went on deck, we following close to Mrs. Thayer and her maid and going up narrow iron stairs to the forward boat deck which, on the Titanic, was the captain's bridge. At the top of the stairs, we found Captain Smith looking much worried and anxiously waiting to get down after we got up. As we leaned against the walls of the officers' quarters, rockets were being fired over our heads, which was most alarming. Shortly after that, the order came from the head dining saloon steward to go down to A deck, when Mrs. Thayer remarked, tell us where to go and we will follow. You ordered us up here, and now you are taking us back. And he said, follow me.
How frustrating.
Oh, very frustrating.
And they're losing confidence clearly in the
yes.
leadership when
Oh, yeah.
this is the exact scenario that caused Edith Rosenbaum to just give up and go to the first class lounge.
In this case, it doesn't seem like there's any one person that is in charge of the actions from the crew's perspective or the officer's perspective. There's different information. There's different things are being said and done. So it would have been very frustrating and very confusing for the passengers.
Yes. And as we've heard in Martha's account, by this point, Titanic's distress rockets were being fired. First-class passenger Jack Thayer wrote in his memoirs how loud it was on deck between the rockets and the steam. Quote, "It was now about 12:45 a.m. The noise was terrific. The deep vibrating roar of the exhaust steam blowing off through the safety valves was deafening, in addition to which they had commenced to send up rockets. It seemed as if we were always waiting for orders, and no orders ever came. People like ourselves were just standing around out of the way. The stokers, dining room stewards, and some others of the crew were lined up waiting for orders. The second and third class passengers were pouring up onto the deck from the stern, augmenting the already large crowd."
Oh my goodness! Well, we've talked about this before. I used to work in a power plant, and the steam, when they would blow the steam off, it was deafening. Mm-hmm. And when you're around loud sounds like that, and if you don't protect your ears, if they had no way to stop that noise from really penetrating into their hearing, it would be very distracting.
Well, let's couple the incredibly loud noise with the fact that there are no clear-cut guidelines and that are not being consistently given, and that you're going back and forth and you're not able to hear the instructions that are being given. Like, this would be...
True. And the one other thing is that it was extremely cold.
Yes.
That's something that I tend to forget. But this was, they were going through ice fields. It was extremely cold on deck that night. Mm-hmm. So that's just, you have all the senses there, cold and extreme sound.
That's true.
Noise. I mean, all those for the body.
And it was dark.
And it was
so
dark,
they're not
yes.
even going to be able to see clearly.
No, so... Yeah, but you had said about the stokers on deck. That is this the first time we've seen stokers? No, there were stokers on deck. We had talked about last episode, I thought.
No, we didn't talk about stokers on deck during Starboard, but we did. It was when we talked about right after the collision where those stokers snuck up to talk to Dr.
That's right.
Washington Dodge. And they were like, yeah, it's really bad down below. And he's like, wait, what? So, no, it is interesting because we don't hear about stokers on deck on the starboard side.
Okay.
But here they are on port, and did you catch we're already talking about third class?
Oh, yes. Yes, I believe this is the first time that we've heard that.
Now, the third class, we heard from a couple in the aft starboard lifeboats.
Okay.
But we haven't even launched the first port lifeboat, and we already have third class people.
Okay.
It's interesting. It is a very interesting discrepancy.
That is very interesting. So, and Jack Thayer's quote reinforces Dr. Washington Dodge's observations about how crowded the port side was. Quote, "At no time were there many people on the starboard side that night. Why was that? The most reasonable explanation that I can give is that the captain was in charge of the launching of the boats on port side. Now, in times of danger, the captain always draws a crowd. The more notable men on board, who were known by sight to the other passengers, knew Captain Smith personally and remained near him. These men attracted others. In this way, the crowd grew on the port side, while at no time was there anything like a crowd on the starboard side. Again, the orders for women and children to go to the port side greatly increased the number there."
So this quote ties in with our discussion in an earlier episode regarding the relationship between Captain Smith and certain first-class passengers. To recap, Captain Smith was quite popular with a certain subset of passengers and had developed a very loyal following. His success was based on three factors. Number one, the primary sources from both passengers and crew portray Captain E.J. Smith as a very pleasant, kind man who took exceptional care of those who sailed with him. Historian Walter Lord referred to him as a, quote, splendid innkeeper. Number two, it was the custom of the time to make the transatlantic crossing with certain captains rather than on a particular ship. So we had talked about this would be the equivalent of, instead of like you're an American Airlines person or you're a Delta person, no, you have a pilot, and wherever that pilot is, that is how you and I are traveling.
Oh boy, that'd be tough.
That would be really tough. So if a passenger particularly liked Captain Smith, he or she would book all future transatlantic passages on whichever ship he was captaining at the time. Over time, this led to a closeness between the captain and repeat passengers, which Walter Lord describes in the following quote. Quote, "This group knew the crew almost as well as each other. It was the custom to cross with certain captains rather than on particular ships, and Captain Smith had a personal following which made him invaluable to the White Star Line. The captain repaid the patronage with little favors and privileges which kept them coming." Remember, certain first-class passengers made a habit of migrating from social season to social season. If those passengers insisted on sailing under Captain Smith every single time, that is a lot of potential business for the White Star Line.
Oh, that certainly would be. So it sounds like he was quite the captain.
Especially at the first-class passenger rate for a ticket.
Oh, my good. Yes, that's true. And number 3, this select group of passengers seem to have made decisions based on groupthink. So according to Lord, the wealthiest of the first-class passengers were a remarkably tightly knit little group. There was a wonderful intimacy about this little world of the Edwardian rich. There was no flicker of surprise when they bumped into each other, whether at the pyramids, a great favorite, the Cowes Regatta, or the springs at Baden-Baden. They seemed to get the same ideas at the same time, and one of these ideas was to make the maiden voyage of the largest ship in the world. So the Titanic's trip was more than like a reunion than an ocean passage. Even 20 years later, Mrs. Henry B. Harris could still remember, quote, "There was a spirit of camaraderie unlike any I experienced on previous trips. No one consulted the passenger list, to judge from the air of good fellowship that prevailed among the cabin passengers. They met on deck as one big party. And this big party wanted to be wherever Captain Smith was, which on the early morning hours of April 15th, 1912, was on the port side of Titanic."
Mm-hmm.
My goodness.
So it makes sense why we already know that the port side was crowded for various factors. We know it's because the women and children had to come to the port side per Captain Smith. We know that the stokers and the third-class passengers had chosen, apparently, the port side for whatever reason. And we know that the people that had a, working relationship or a personal relationship, what have you, were just choosing the port side because of Captain Smith.
So it's a lot more crowded than the starboard.
Yes. So already that is going to be a huge discrepancy between the two, which is going to play a part as we move through the night.
Okay, very good.
So leaving boat number 4 hanging outside the promenade deck A windows, the crew went back up to the boat deck and started working on forward port boats 8 and 6. For years, it has been said that boat number 6 launched first. However, the latest research in the article Titanic, the lifeboat launching sequence re-examined, they assert the first lifeboat to launch was actually number 8 at 1 a.m. with about 28 people on board. Just as a note for context, by 1 a.m., starboard lifeboats 7, 5, and 3 had already been launched.
Oh, so there's been quite a delay here on the port side.
There is.
Interesting.
Number 4 really messed them up.
Wow. And the boat was listing. It began to list before, so I would imagine that's getting worse. So tensions, I would imagine, are running high, a little higher than they
and I'm
were
sure
before.
there's quite a bit of frustration.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Second Officer Lightoller by this point has already sent some crew to find the crank. He's already sent people down below to open one of the gangways. So we already are seeing that there is less crew available on the port side.
Very interesting.
So before we continue, there's a crucial point to establish. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch had implemented a women and children first policy, emphasis on first. This allowed men to board a lifeboat when there were no other women available or willing to do so. In stark contrast, on the port side, Second Officer Lightoller adopted the very firm stance of women and children only. This resulted in men and women being separated from one another on the port side, often forcibly.
All right, so we're getting more people. It's getting more dire, more chaotic, and now the instructions being given are separating,
and they're harder. Yes.
Separating husbands and wives, separating could be older children from their mothers.
Yes.
So that would definitely add to the tension and going on at the time. So wow. So first-class passenger Carolyn Bonnell's account detailed the separation of women and men prior to loading the lifeboats. Carolyn, along with her uncle, aunt, and cousin, followed the officer's orders and climbed from Promenade Deck 8 up to the boat deck, where Carolyn secured a seat on boat number 8. In her account, Carolyn wrote, quote, The women were told to stand by in a group by themselves and to be ready to get into the lifeboats. The men drew back, and the women stood at the railing. This was a condition which prevailed on our side of the boat. On the other side, the men and women were not told to separate, and that accounts for the men who were being saved. Mr. Ismay, director of the line, was on that side of the boat, and so of course got in one of the lifeboats with the other men. There was very little excitement. In fact, there was practically none. People had to be begged to get into the lifeboats. No one thought the Titanic was going to sink, and passengers didn't feel like trusting themselves to tiny rowboats when they were on the biggest liner in the world. At least, so they argued with the officers. As soon as the men withdrew, the women were told to get into the lifeboats. Most of them who did so were urged to do so by their relatives, the officers taking little part in it. We never once saw the captain. As we took to the oars, the officers shouted to us to row over to a distant light and to stand there, sending the boat back for others.
And to land there.
I'm sorry, land there and sending boat back for others. So a distant light. To land there?
To land there.
Where the heck are they going to land?
Get there, put the people on with the light, and send the boat back to pick up more people.
So they're thinking that the boat won't sink. They're thinking that something nearby is safety for them.
Yes, to offload and to come back.
And to come back and get others.
Yes. So let's talk about this mystery light. This is something that I saw again and again and again as I was reading through the various inquiries. And even in my notes, I'm like, mystery light? Like, what are you? So during episode number 5, we had talked about how the passengers were subjected to a long wait as the crew prepped the lifeboats. And remember, at that point, they mistakenly believed they would just be told to return to their beds. So to pass the time, they were comparing rumors about the various ships that were allegedly rushing to Titanic's side. And they stared out across the water at a mysterious white light off the ship's port bow. Which means, I mean, if you think about it, that means only people on the port side are going to talk about this light. On the starboard side, they never saw it. So that's why we never heard about it.
Okay, interesting.
So first-class passenger Archibald Gracie recorded seeing this light with his very own eyes. Our hopes were buoyed with the information imparted through the ship's officers that there had been an interchange of wireless messages with passing ships, one of which was certainly coming to our rescue. To reassure the ladies of whom I had assumed special charge, I showed them a bright white light of what I took to be a ship about 5 miles off and which I felt sure was coming to our rescue. So that would have been before he left the women in the care of 6th Officer Moody.
So there's a light out there, and it looks fairly close, and they're out in the middle of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
I mean, there had to have been something real for them to see that.
Exactly. And by the time that first-class passenger Jack Thayer wrote his memoirs, it was almost universally accepted that the mystery light belonged to the Californian, which is another ship. Quote, while I did not see the masthead lights of the SS Californian, many claimed that they did see them. My mother watched them for some time while on the port side waiting to get into a lifeboat, and Second Officer Lightoller told me he positively saw them.
Oh, wow.
So this is not just one or two people. This is a good deal of people are seeing this mystery light. So now whether or not it was the Californian is still something that is debated today, but more on that later, I promise.
Okay, well, good, because I want to know more about that.
Yeah, I will give you all
here we are in the middle. I want to say we're like 400 miles from land. I mean, we're a good distance from land.
Oh, don't ask me that. I don't remember
That's
how far
okay.
we are right now.
And there's a light that is at that level that looks like another ship. I mean, it couldn't have been mistaken for a star or anything else.
You say that, but people claim that it could have been Star. It could have been a fishing schooner. It could have been the Californian. It could have been this. I mean, like, it's crazy. There's a historian that has a theory about the reflection and like the curvature of the earth. I mean, we will get into it all.
Okay. I'm looking forward to that because I do want to know more about that.
You got it.
According to first-class passenger Dr. Washington Dodge, the fact that other liners were coming to the rescue had a profound effect on the decisions made by some of the passengers. Quote, many expressed their determination to take their chances with the steamer rather than embark in the lifeboats. This unusual circumstance may be accounted for by the fact that the officers had insisted that under the worst conditions possible, the Titanic could not sink in less than 8 or 10 hours, and that a number of steamers had been communicated with by wireless and would be standing by to offer relief within an hour or two. So there you go. There's the unsinkable ship and help's on the way.
Someone's coming.
Someone's coming. First-class passenger Cornelia Andrew also correlated the passengers' behavior with the information being spread about the other ships. Quote, "The discipline was good, probably because none of us appreciated the danger. They told us the Olympic would pick us up in 2 hours and that the ship would stand for hours without sinking." So here's another. I mean,
Yep.
they're being told, so if the passengers were advised the Olympic was only 2 hours away, they could very well believe that the white light off the port bow was Titanic's sister ship steaming to the rescue. So, I mean, if that was the case, if the Olympic was so close that they could literally see her approaching, then why bother boarding the tiny lifeboats currently being lowered overboard?
I mean,
I can certainly see that.
they're literally playing music in the lounge and they're serving hot cocoa and booze. What? I'm not leaving.
Well, I mean, yeah, and you're right. It's cold, it's noisy, and we have 8 to 10 hours. We have ships in the area. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is a lot of information.
We're having our fancy dress party in Dante's Hell down below.
That's a great quote.
Oh,
yes.
That's a great. I love it so much.
And you're right. I mean, there's things that we're seeing here that, I mean, if I was there, would I have felt uncomfortable? Would I have felt danger? Would I have felt that things were really going to be dire and fatal? I don't know.
And I appreciate that she said the discipline was good, probably because none of us appreciated the danger. This is something that comes up again and again during the inquiries. They're asking, were people, when they say excited, they don't mean that in a positive way. They mean that in a, I guess we could correlate that with being panicked. Maybe
Okay.
they mean it. So when they say, was anybody excited? They mean, was there a was there a heightening of emotion?
Mm-hmm.
Is I think the best way I would describe it.
Okay.
And so a lot of no, they were great. Oh no, they were wonderful. And again, there's this idea of that stiff upper lip.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter what's going to happen. They are going to go down with dignity and decorum. And she's going like, well, none of us really understood what was happening.
Yes, and it's easier for us here, past the what occurred to them looking backwards. And
Right.
It's easier for us to say, oh, they should have known this and they should have known that. But in this case here, what we're talking about, ships that are coming to rescue, a ship that cannot sink or a ship that cannot sink from where it'll at least be...
Or fatally sink. She
Fatally
can
sink,
take
right.
on
She can
water,
take
but
on
she's
water.
not going all the way under.
Right, and there's still, hours to go, and they're only a couple hours out. I mean,
And we see the light. It'll be here soon.
Right, so that's information that would definitely have affected the decision that some people made.
Absolutely.
No doubt about it.
So let's return to forward port boat number 8. We have heard from first-class passenger Gladys Cherry in previous episodes. She was one who was personally told by Captain Smith about the lifebelt order. After returning to her stateroom and finding a lifebelt, with the help of a steward who did not even know that the lifebelt order had been given, Gladys returned to the boat deck and boarded boat number 8. In a letter to her mother, Gladys shared that she could barely bring herself to write down the details of that night. Quote, "As I try to write this, as I know you will want to know, it seems as if I can't, for it's all too terrible. The lowering of that boat 75 feet into the darkness seemed too awful. When we reached the water, I felt we had done a foolish thing to leave that big safe boat. But when we had rowed a few yards, we saw that great ship with her bows right down in the water. The captain gave us orders to row to a light he saw and come back to the boat to get others. We were only 24 women and 3 men, and we could have held 50.
And that's probably why they may have been a couple reasons why there weren't as many people in the boat. So there are some quotes on the size of the lifebelts and how it made it crowded. Mm-hmm. And also they're thinking, okay, well, you were over there, drop them off, and then basically you're going to come back and get others. So
right.
we're going
and
to
if
get
they think
more
the ship
people.
is coming to them, chances are they think that the lifeboat won't have to row too far and they'll meet in the middle.
Right.
And so then also this would take care of the in-air capacity versus the in-water capacity. There's a lot of things that this makes sense. And you'll also notice this is going to stay consistent. So as we talk about lifeboat number 8 and even into lifeboat number 6, you will hear this again and again.
I also think it's interesting that her steward did not even note the lifebelt order had been given.
Yes.
So here you have all this going on, this confusion, something's happening, and not even all of the crew were knowledgeable or knew what to do or told what to do. So there was no consistency.
Well, and also it's going to take away that sense of urgency. Because if you're being told, go get your life belt, and then you go to your steward and it goes, oh, I didn't even know we needed those. It's going to be like, do I really need to do this?
Very confusing. So first-class passenger Constance Willard was only 21 years old when she traveled on Titanic. After the sinking, she shared this story with the Chicago Tribune. Quote, "When I reached the deck after the collision, the crew were getting the boats ready to lower, and many of the women were running about looking for their husbands and children. The women were being placed in the boats, and two men took hold of me and almost pushed me into a boat. I did not appreciate the danger, and I struggled until they released me. 'Do not waste time. Let her go if she will not get in,' an officer said. I hurried back to my cabin again and went from cabin to cabin looking for my friends, but could not find them. A little English girl about 15 years old ran up to me and threw her arms around me. 'Oh, I'm all alone,' she sobbed. 'Won't you let me go with you?' I then began to realize the real danger and saw that all but two of the boats had been lowered. Some men called to us, and we hurried to where they were loading a boat. All the women had been provided with lifebelts. As the men lifted us into the boat, they smiled at us and told us to be brave. Most women were compelled to stand in the boats because they all wore the lifebelts, which made it almost impossible to sit down."
So this is my question. When I read this quote for the first time, I was like, wait a minute. Could the bulky lifebelts that, like she said, they were compelled to stand because it made it almost impossible to sit down. Could the bulky lifebelts be why the boats seemed, quote, full, even though they held a fraction of the people that they should have?
It could. I mean, it could very well be. It could be that there was, you would think that would have been taken into account when they planned the lifeboats and the number of people, unless they didn't think about that.
Because they say that the lifeboats have a capacity
variable
for 65, but what does that mean exactly? So if they say, it's 65 men, are they getting 65 men of the same weight?
Well,
are those 65 men wearing lifebelts in the lifeboat?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, you're right.
Did
they just take 65 people, put them in the boat? But then we've seen quotes where they're talking about it seems so dangerous to lower the boats, and they felt like if more people were put in, it could topple over and put them in more danger, especially with it starting to list down at the bow.
Right.
So we're talking about a really tough way of lowering at an angle. Lowering the boat level in comparison to the angle of the ship.
That is super true. It's going to be hard enough to lower it evenly, even if the boat is not at an angle.
Yes.
And not only is she going down at the bow, she's listing. And when we say listing, we mean like listing to starboard, listing to port. So she is down at the bows and then listing. At one point, she's listing to starboard. At one point, she's listing to port because as the different compartments were filling with water, one side would become heavier than the other.
Yeah, that'd make it very difficult to launch a lifeboat.
Yes, it would. Now, another way we can interpret this, just in the spirit of thinking through all of our options. So we could be talking about they were compelled to stand because the lifebelts were so bulky that they couldn't sit and they were all crammed in. Or could they be saying that they couldn't sit because they were bulky, as in like they couldn't bend at the hip?
I'm not sure.
I don't know.
I've not seen a picture of one of these. I'd like to see one. Maybe we should.
We'll find a picture.
Yeah,
but anyway, just in the interest of not giving you one interpretation,
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious. I'm very curious. And we're going to talk about the lifebelts later because we're going to have a cork issue. CORK.
Oh, yes.
There's the cork issue. Okay. So, first-class passenger Ella White survived by escaping in boat number 8. She gave the following testimony at the U.S. Senate inquiry, quote, "Nothing had been said about the lifeboats in any way when suddenly Captain Smith came down the stairway and ordered us all to put on our life preservers, which we did. He said we must go back again, then to deck A, which we did to get into the boats. I entered the lifeboat from the top deck, where the boats were. We had to enter the boat there. There was no other deck to the steamer except the top deck. It was a perfect rat trap. There was no other deck that was open at all. How could they fill the lifeboats properly? They could not lower a lifeboat 70 feet with any degree of safety with more than 20 people in it. Where were they going to get any more in them on the way down? There were no other open decks."
Well, thinking about that, if you're standing, your center of gravity is going to be very high. So if there's a kind of movement, you're going to be jostling back and forth, forward, back, or whatever. It's safer to sit. It's safer to get your
it's much safer.
Yeah, your center of gravity down lower. So, there certainly would have been. They're lowering with 20 people. It makes me wonder: was just the rowing to the light and coming back the plan? Was opening a gangway like we had talked about in previous episodes?
I know Norman Chambers had talked about hearing the order for a gangway to be opened, and like I had just said, Second Officer Lightoller did send people to go open the gangway. Unfortunately, this never happened. Like Norman Chambers said, he's like, I never saw anybody open it. And we'll see quotes today where they say, actually, it's either today or next time, saying, I did not see the gangway open.
And so far, we haven't run across anything that has said that.
So no matter what, so either the boat is going to need to come down low enough that are they going to have people jump? Like, how exactly are they planning on getting, even if the boats come back, how are they going to get the people from Titanic into the boat that's already been launched in the water?
There had to have been a plan. The only way I can think of is something close to the water line, something like.
Or if they had like a ladder, or not a, not a wooden ladder, a metal ladder, but like a rope ladder. Exactly.
That would be tough. Have you ever climbed a rope ladder?
Not successfully.
I tell you, when I was a kid, I did some boating, and I was swimming off the side of a boat one time, and I tried climbing up a rope ladder, and I tell you, it was. I wish there had been funniest videos that day, 'cause it was tough. So
I'm not confident in my upper body strength to pull that off.
Yeah. So, in first-class passenger Marie Young's account, we are exposed to some of the same issues the passenger observed regarding the crew. Quote. The captain was beside us, and from a hamper nearby, he threw a large loaf of bread into the boat. To a group of waiting seamen and stewards, we heard the question put, "Can you row?" No sailor had any station assigned him for any boat, and this scratch crew had known no boat drills. Eagerly, 4 men entered our boat as oarsmen, and with only 22 souls aboard, we were lowered away from the height of 80 feet into the sea. Captain Smith called to us to pull for a green light in the distance, to unload passengers and return to the boat at once. We left above us weeping wives who refused to leave their husbands, and young mothers who had come up to place nurses and babies in a boat. They went below to save their children, but they were not seen again. I mean, here we go, a light again, another a green light, a white light.
Something's out there.
Something's out there, and it makes me wonder what. Have you seen any other information about a green light other than the quotes we've read?
I wonder, maybe as if there is a white light and a green light. Mm-hmm. I think it's one and the same.
One and the same?
To be honest with you. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's also, and we can get into the whole light issue. And again, if you're getting into like the curvature of the earth and blah, 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 we can talk about the different colored lights.
Okay.
When we get into that.
Well, no, the curvature of the earth does make a difference, though, because you will lose line of sight, because there is a curvature. So it is going to. But as for the lighting and what you would see as a bright light, that I don't know.
I'm not sure about that, but I will certainly look into it.
Okay.
So the issue of crew incompetence / unpreparedness was also addressed by first-class passenger Major Arthur Puchin during the U.S. Senate inquiry. Quote, I might say I was rather surprised that the sailors were not at their stations, as I have seen fire drills very often on steamers where they all stand at attention, so many men at the bow and stern of these lifeboats. They seem to be short of sailors around the lifeboats that were being lowered at this particular point. I do not know what was taking place on other parts of the steamer. Later on, during the same testimony, the following conversation took place between Senator Fletcher and Major Puchin. Daddy's going to read the part of Senator Fletcher. I will read Major Puchin's response to the question.
Oh, this is Senator Fletcher. Quote, you said, I believe, that there seemed to be a lack of competent sailors to take charge of the lifeboats.
Major Puchin replied, quote, I would not like to say that, sir. I said they were not at their stations ready to man the boats. I imagine this crew was what we would call in yachting terms a scratch crew brought from different vessels. They might be the best, but they had not been accustomed to working together.
And that would make it very difficult in a situation like this.
And you're not going to have that understanding and that shorthand to communicate well.
Right. When you're in a situation like this, you want to be with a group of people that you know exactly what they're going to do and how they're going to do. And
you can count on them.
Yes, and each part is going to do each person is going to do their part as it needs to be done. Whereas if there is a disorganization or a disharmony in this group, that wouldn't happen.
Well, any sort of a wild card could throw everything off.
Sure. So this is not the first time we've heard about Titanic's crew failing to work together as a team. In episode 3, we listened to multiple accounts that illustrate a lack of organization and cohesion among the crew members. So I'm not going to reread them all, but here's just briefly recount that there was second-class passenger Imanita Shelley, whose meals were, quote, ruined because the stewardesses had no trays, so they had to bring the plates, utensils, and entrees one at a time to Imanita's stateroom. This delay in serving meant that Emanita ate cold meals for the entire voyage. Even after complaining multiple times, she reported, quote, "No relief was obtained. There seemed to be no organization at all."
And then there was first-class passenger Norman Chambers, who observed, quote, "A large percentage of the steward part of the crew were new. My own room steward complained to me on the second day out that he did not know where anything was on the ship and that no one would tell him." And then there was first-class passenger Mahala Douglas's affidavit to the U.S. Senate inquiry, in which she relayed a story that went beyond mere lack of organization into a failure to adhere to protocol. According to Mahala, she and her husband watched a crew member try to dip a pail into the ocean below. After several unsuccessful attempts, the crew member gave up, filled the pail from a water spigot on the ship, took the temperature of that water, and went off to report his findings to a nearby officer.
Oh, my goodness.
Now, keep in mind, the purpose of taking the temperature of the ocean water is to determine how close you are to encountering ice.
So taking it off the ship's not going to give you that information.
Okay, so I mentioned this to my husband because he's former military, and he goes, "My gosh, that is something a private would totally do. You wanted water, I gave you temperature of water."
There you go.
I was just like, oh, well, that's disappointing,
Yeah,
but
that is
thank you for that. So before the collision, the lack of unity amongst the crew was merely an annoyance. After the collision, it was deadly.
So let's circle back to boat number 8.
We are still in boat number 8,
We're
people.
still in boat number 8. So first-class passenger Ella White had plenty of observations about the crew that she willingly shared during the U.S. Senate inquiry.
And loudly.
Quote, "Before we cut loose from the ship, 2 of the seamen with us, the men, I should say, I do not call them seamen, I think they were dining room stewards. Before we were cut loose from the ship, they took out cigarettes and lighted them. On an occasion like that, all of those men escaped under the pretense of being oarsmen. The man who rowed me took his oar and rowed all over the boat in every direction. I said to him, 'Why don't you put the oar in the oarlock?' He said, 'Do you put it in that hole?' I said, 'Certainly.' He said, 'I've never had an oar in my hand before.' I spoke to the other man, and he said, 'I've never had an oar in my hand before, but I think I can row.' Those were the men that we were put to sea with that night. With all this magnificent fellows left on board, who would have been such a protection to us?"
Okay, so I'm sorry, but how funny is the pearl clutching about the men smoking?
At a time like that, but I mean, someone who doesn't even know what to do with an oar.
Yeah, he doesn't even know to put it in the hole.
That would be tough to row without it being secured.
It's gonna be hard enough to row with it secured. Like, I'm sorry,
yeah.
if I have just survived the potential sinking of the boat from under me, I might light up too.
Oh yeah,
I'm just gonna say.
There you go.
Smoke them if you got them. All right, so we're gonna move to boat number 6. Forward port boat number 6 launched at 1:10 a.m. with about 28 people. Because number 6 and number 8 were lowered at about the same time, there are passenger accounts that say that number 6 was actually the first to launch. So one of the passengers in number 6 was Helen Churchill Candy, the lady who likened the first-class lounge to the fancy dress ball in Dante's Hell.
Oh, I love that quote.
I know. She was traveling alone and had been offered protection by first-class passenger Hugh Woolner. He wrote in a letter to his family, quote, "I went with a Swedish friend whose acquaintance I had made on board, Bjornstrom Stephenson, and sought out the lady who had been recommended to my care, Mrs. Churchill Candy. We found her and took her up to the A deck to see how things were going. We found the engine stopped and the officers and crew making preparations to lower the boats. The officers were assuring everyone that there was no danger to life, but that the ladies were to be put into the boats as a precautionary measure. Bjornstrom and I took Mrs. Candy up to the upper deck where the boats were hung, and we put her safely into the first boat. We then bade her a cheery goodbye and told her we should help her on board again when the ship had steadied herself. She wanted us to come too, but we laughed this off."
Wow. So they're thinking that they're going to be coming back.
Yeah, everything's going to be fine. She's going to come back. We are going to help her get back on board.
Wow. So that is, wow. So although first-class passenger Margaret Brown actively encouraged other ladies to board boat number 6, she did not intend to leave Titanic yet. Instead, Margaret headed towards the starboard side to see what was happening over there. She later gave this story to the Newport Herald. Quote, "I was walking away eager to see what was being done with the boats on the other side, not fearing any immediate danger, thinking if the worst should happen, I could swim out. Suddenly I saw a shadow, and a few seconds later I was taken hold of, and with the words, "You're going too," I was dropped fully 4 feet into the lowering lifeboat. As we reached a sea as smooth as glass, we looked up and saw the benign, resigned countenance of our beloved captain as he peered down upon us like a solicitous father, directing us to row to the light in the distance, and all boats keep together.
There's that light again.
There's that light again. So, so she's thrown in a boat. And
4 feet, which I'm only 5 feet tall. So
that wouldn't be pleasant. And there's people in that boat. So
Yes.
there had to have been a few people that may would have gotten
and this is the
she landed on.
This is the unsinkable
Molly
Brown.
Molly Brown.
Yep.
Oh, okay. All right. So in Lifeboat 6, Margaret's reluctance to disembark makes more sense when juxtaposed with the following quote from first-class passenger Martha Stone. Quote, "I do not think anybody thought for a moment that the ship could sink. The crew must have known, but the passengers certainly did not. I know that this was the reason why many husbands and wives were separated. The women did not want to leave their husbands, but I think that many of them felt, as I did, that they were simply going away for a time that they might not be in the way, and in order to avoid any possible risk, and that we would soon return." So here we have it again.
Mm-hmm.
They're thinking the ship's not going to sink. We're going to go away and come back.
Mm-hmm. We just don't want to be in the way of the crew. They have things to do. This is just checking off a checklist for safety reasons.
Right, so this also supports Hugh Woolner's attitude that passengers who had left in the lifeboats would be reboarding.
Yes,
So,
but he's not alone in this.
oh yeah, no, he's just one of many that they thought that this was going to happen there. So it really hadn't sunk in for a lot of the passengers
Mm-hmm.
that this was very dangerous, and their lives, they had better take steps to preserve and to save their own lives.
Well, and like we've talked about in multiple episodes about a confirmation bias or an anchoring bias.
Mm-hmm.
The people who believed that there was a problem from the get-go continued to believe there was a problem, a serious, deadly problem.
Mm-hmm.
Those who did not think there was a problem continued on, at least up until this point, and even further than this point, to believe that there really wasn't a problem. Now remember, Archibald Gracie thought from the very beginning that there was something to fear.
Mm-hmm.
And so while Boat 8 and 6 were being loaded and launched up on the boat deck, first-class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie had been keeping busy. First, he went back down to his stateroom to grab extra blankets, knowing people would need them as they went off in the lifeboats. But he found his room locked. When he asked a nearby steward why this was, Gracie was informed that all the rooms were locked, quote, to prevent looting. Looting. We're going to circle back to this. Give me a second.
Okay.
So then Gracie starts systematically searching all the public rooms on Promenade Deck A to find the rest of his table companions, including Mrs. Helen Churchill Candy. He wrote, quote, "I then went the length of the ship inside on this glass-enclosed Deck A from aft forwards, looking in every room and corner for my missing table companions, but no passengers whatever were to be seen except in the smoking room. And there all alone by themselves seated around a table were 4 men, 3 of whom were personally well known to me, Major Butt, Clarence Moore, and Frank Millette, but the 4th was a stranger whom I therefore cannot identify. All 4 seemed perfectly oblivious of what was going on the decks outside. It's impossible to suppose that they did not know of the collision with the iceberg, and that the room they were in had been deserted by all others who had hastened away. It occurred to me at the time that these men desired to show their entire indifference to the danger, and that if I advised them as to how seriously I regarded it, they would laugh at me. This was the last time I saw any of them.
Wow.
I next found myself on the port side, part of the time on the boat deck, part on the deck below it called Deck A, where I rejoined Clinch Smith, who reported that Mrs. Candy had departed on one of the boats. Remember, she had been loaded into boat number 6 by Hugh Woolner and Bjornstrom Stephenson.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I've got thoughts. Number 1, why bother wasting the time as a steward to lock the staterooms?
Yeah, I don't understand that unless it was a procedure or a policy that they had that if people were to muster on the decks, I'm curious if there had been documented cases of looting on steamships, White Star Line or steamships back
I can
then.
see that, but also it's like, okay, so one has to assume that this steward at the very least is not aware of the seriousness of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you were told this ship is literally going to be at the bottom of the ocean in about 2 hours, would you really waste the time going through how many 6 to 8 stories, a sixth of a mile long, essentially locking every room.
Well, that doesn't make sense. You're right. If he knew that, that would make no sense for him to do that.
Right.
You're right.
So
You're right.
I'm assuming that if he was instructed to do this, it was by somebody who was similarly not aware of what Thomas Andrews had said.
True. Yeah, that makes sense because why would it matter?
Exactly.
If they knew the ship was going to sink in 2 hours, why are you locking a stateroom door?
Yes.
That
And then,
makes
like
sense.
we had talked about before, Archibald Gracie, from the moment the collision happened, when he felt those engines stop, he knew something was wrong. Everything that he did, every investigation he took, every step that he's taken is with the feeling that something is seriously wrong and that he needs to be of assistance. And he continues that on, even in the face of people that are, like he says, they're entirely indifferent. They do not appreciate the danger. And he's like, if I told them how I felt, they would laugh at me.
True. Yeah, you're right. There, he was all in it. He basically was standing out among the crowd. No one. It was like someone just they weren't listening to him, or like in this case, he didn't want to share because they just would have laughed at him anyway. So, so while Colonel Gracie was convinced that Titanic's circumstances were dire, there are many who were still completely convinced that it was safer to remain on the ship. The following quote from first-class passenger Henry Fronthal encapsulates this mindset. Quote, "When I went on the boat deck, there were a few people there, but no confusion, and I saw them lowering the boats. I returned to my cabin for my wife, and in passing Mr. Widener, I informed him that I had learned the boat was in danger, but he said that it was ridiculous. This answer probably describes the mental state of nearly everyone on the boat, thinking that it was impossible for anything serious to happen to this paragon of modern ship architecture."
There you have it.
There you have it. So, I mean, yeah, people are thinking it's ridiculous that anything can happen, and
It's laughable.
Colonel Gracie is definitely a man that knew that there was an issue, and he dealt.
He was an
aggressively.
outlier.
Yeah, he was an outlier, definitely.
But he's also, and we're going to talk about Gracie a good deal more, he jumps in with a fervor to help. So as we are having less crew members available, he and Second Officer Lightoller do a lot of the work on the port side to help get the boats into the water. He is an amazing witness.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, excellent.
So as we've discussed during the starboard episodes, somewhere around 1:05 to 1:10 a.m., a rumor went around that the men were being allowed to board the port lifeboats. This resulted in a mass movement from the starboard side over to the port side, with the male passengers amassing around the aft port lifeboats. They were getting so unruly that the starboard crew crossed over to the port side to help dispel the chaos. As we discussed in episode 7, this delayed the launching of the aft starboard lifeboats. It was during this critical time, the rumor, the movement, the crew, that the forward port boats 8 and 6 were launched. So after those boats were safely in the water, the port crew left the forward port neighborhood with boat number 2 still in the davits and hurried up the slanting deck towards the stern. The attitude of the swelling crowd had turned ugly, and the crew hoped that by launching the aft port lifeboats, some of the tension would be dispelled. So believe it or not, we're actually going to leave the forward port neighborhood for now. But before we do that, let's briefly recap. By 1:10 a.m., both boats 8 and 6 had been launched, each of which contained about 28 people. Boat number 2 was still hanging on the davits waiting to be loaded, and boat number 4 was hanging outside of Promenade Deck A windows, absolutely useless, until the crew could manually lower the windows and allegedly chop away the wooden spar that was just below it in the way.
A spar. That is a very interesting thing that gentleman said.
I want to know.
So do I.
I might actually email him. I would love to email him and be like, "Sir, where did that come from?"
Where did that come from? I mean, the boat is designed for emergency
They're gonna have to lower.
lifeboats. Yeah, so what could be put in the way?
But granted, if they think that they're literally never going to use them, but again, if you look at the pictures, I don't.
Well, it is interesting, and so when it comes down to, you've done a tremendous amount of research, and I really appreciate you finding these voices to help us get a clearer picture as to what they were experiencing during that horrible event that they went through. Because there definitely was, it's easy to watch a movie and it's easy to know what happened from our perspective, but those are real people living lives that had to make decisions based on what was right in front of them, what they were being told, what they felt, what they saw, what they believed, and they made decisions based on that. And some people their lives were spared, and a lot of people, they lost their lives.
Yes.
And for a lot of reasons, but I believe that a lot of the big reasons were the fact of the unsinkability and just really not knowing that there was that there was danger, and that they didn't act quickly enough, and there also weren't enough lifeboats.
Yes.
There just wasn't enough.
Bottom line, it will always be the fault of the White Star Line for not including enough lifeboats.
Yes, because there were some quotes we've read where people believed everyone would be saved, and if I was a passenger, I would hope that everyone would be saved. There'd be something for everyone.
And I think there is we've talked about this before. There's the assumption as a passenger, as a consumer of a product or a service, that there are certain quality, what's the word I'm looking for? Not factors. There's an ensurement
there's an expectation.
Yes, there's a quality expectation where you assume that, like, if there were to be a problem, if we went to go take a cruise and something happens, I would assume that the crew knows what to do. They're going to tell me where to go. They're going to do their best to assist me and my family in surviving this.
Yes.
And that my survival is not actually in question. It's just going to be a matter of making sure.
Yes. No, that would be an expectation I would definitely have. And it's like you go on an airline or you go on a train or you do any kind of transportation, my expectation is that my safety is of utmost importance to them.
Right.
So I would imagine there was probably that mindset here as well.
Yes.
So thank you for this research you've done. It's been such an eye opener for me to really learn that you're helping me learn about what happened through the voices of these people. So
next episode, we are going to be getting into so much good stuff, because as we move into the aft port neighborhood, this is where Jack Thayer has already made the comment that we have the crowd that is being augmented by the stokers and the third-class passengers. On the port side, you are going to see that third-class passengers play a much larger role in how these neighborhoods are acting. So we're going to start listening to a lot more third.
Very good.
It's so exciting.
Looking forward to it. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We appreciate your comments, insights, ideas for future episodes. You can send us an email at theprimarynerdpodcast@gmail.com. You can also send us comments at our website, theprimarynerd.com. And you can also catch us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and you can catch our podcast also on the primarynerd.com website.
Those are just the previous 3 episodes.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. The previous 3 will be on the website. Spotify, Google, and Apple have all of our episodes.
And then, of course, we're going to post the sources, so
Yes.
you will have all of those, including some of the different analyses of the numbers of people in lifeboats. So if you want to dive down that rabbit hole at 2 a.m., you are more than welcome. I will give you the tools to do so.
Yeah, so that the history it's about all of us. So it's way cool that thank you for the comments and the people who reached out to us.
And
we
the
appreciate
love.
that.
We've gotten so much love.
Yes.
It's great.
And we appreciate you. We love what we do. We love history and we love exploring this and other topics, and it's just such a wonderful opportunity that we can be together.
And it's so nice to have it for people that have a similar interest,
Yes.
that appreciate. They're like, go down that rabbit hole, please. I welcome it.
So with that said, we're going to sign off, and
I'm Courtney.
I'm Brian.
And this is The Primary Nerd.